Hello everyone and welcome back to the Forge. Now today we're going to be addressing one of the most common questions I get asked, and that is I want to make a knife but I don't have a forge. How do I do that? And so we're going to be taking this Nicholson file right here and I'm going to show you how that's done today. So let's go ahead and jump in. Now the first important thing with this is steel selection. Okay, now we're not going to have the means to heat treat this, especially if you're starting out, you don't have a forge, you don't have torches and all of that stuff. That's going to be able to put out the heat that you would need to get it up to the proper temperature. So most usually you'll be able to find files pretty much anywhere. You can find them at yard sales, flea markets, junk stores, hardware stores if you just want to go buy a new one. And it's going to give you something that already comes hardened. They are in the mid-60s most usually on the hardness scale. Now the second thing that we're going to need to do this right is a template of some sort, because we're going to want to lay our knife template on here, cut the steel off, and cut or grind around it to get our shape. Now, you can sit down. A lot of times when I'm freehand drawing a knife, I'll put masking tape over my steel to draw it on there, especially on stock removal things, and I can get an idea of what I can fit in that space. Even when I rough forge something out, I will still go back and I will kind of draw. I'll have a design in mind, but I'll go back and draw where I need to grind off parts to get the design that I need. A lot of designs you can find on the internet for free. A good rule of thumb, from what I've learned, is you want your handle about 4.5 inches. That tends to be a comfortable handle. And blade length, usually for an EDC knife for everyday carry, would be in the ballpark of about 3 inches. And so this is the template right here that I got online. I modified the template. It was actually had a lot shorter handle, so I just drew the handle out and taped it on there so I'd have a longer handle. But this is the design that we're going to be going with for this project. And I know the first thing right off the bat is, how are we going to cut this out? Well, you can come in here with an angle grinder and cut off the hard portions, but when you do that, you want to make certain that you don't cut all the way up to the edge of your line where you trace this template out, because we don't want to lose the hardness in that edge. We don't want to blue the steel. We want it to stay as hard as we can. And like I said, we'll take it to the angle grinder and clean up the profile on it. Do a Google search on free knife templates. That's how I found this one. Kind of modified it to what I want. So let's get ready to move on. Alright, I got a cheap can of spray paint. Gonna kind of spray this on the outsides here to help mark out where the knife template's going to be. Now this won't be perfect, but it'll be close enough for us to get it where we need to get it with a grinder. And for those of you that may be wondering, yes, those were rocks I used to weight the paper down with. Remember, this is an entry-level knife making build. I don't have any magnets with me. Anyway, and there we go. That is our template. We're going to go and take the angle grinder and we're going to cut it off right here, and then go in on the belt grinder and start cleaning that up. And I will be using my broad belt grinder in this video because it's all that I have. When I first got into knife making, I actually had a Grizzly 1x30 grinder. I think that right now, currently, they're $50-something at Harbor Freight. So, I mean, it's not like they're a super expensive tool. But I can tell you that they do have a large assortment of belts, aftermarket ceramic belts that are really good for them nowadays. You can get belts from Red Label abrasives and Combat abrasives. Everything from the super low grit ceramics all the way up to surface conditioning belts. So the belt selection is pretty good nowadays. So let's go ahead and get this cut off and start grinding our profile out. Now for this next step, please wear eye protection. I don't care how you've done it your entire life using grinders or whatever it is. You only have 2 eyes. And it would really suck to start out your knife making journey on your very first knife and mess up your eyes. So with that being said, I will be wearing a full face shield, and I'm going to go ahead and cut this off. Also, save your end piece here, because as you progress and you get into forging out knives, this right here we can make another knife wheel. In fact, down the road, when we as we progress in these videos, we'll be making a knife out of this piece. So let's move on to grinding this to shape. Alright, now as we grind this, you are going to want to have a coffee can or a bucket or something of water around to dip it in. We do not want to overheat this steel as we work this, or we'll lose everything we're working towards, especially here on the blade edge. The spine would be okay, the tip is not okay, the handle's okay. We do not want the tip or the edge getting too hot. Also, you're going to want some sort of lung protection, some sort of breathing equipment. An N95 mask would work perfectly fine. Just make sure you wear safety goggles. I know Ben Abbott, he said that he wears an N95 whenever he grinds. I have this gas mask I bought off of Amazon, and so that's what I'll be wearing. But N95 masks are pretty common nowadays, especially with the situation that's going on in the world today. So, you know, get you one of those, some safety goggles, and you're set up. So, let's go ahead and get this grinder turned on and get to work. Alright, now that we've got our profile all ground in, it's ready to move on to the next step. First though, if you noticed when I first started doing this at the beginning of the video, our template had a little bit of a harpoon point up here at the top. And I was really hoping to get this in on this one, but it actually ended up being just a little too narrow, and I would have kind of messed up the flow of the design. So I just went ahead and scrapped that. Just went with a flat top, which if you're doing this with an angle grinder, would make it 100 times easier. So let's move on to the next step. Alright, now the next step is going to be tempering this back. Like I said at the beginning, this is already hardened into the mid-60s, and we don't want that. We want this tempered back to around 58, 59, in that ballpark. And the way that we're going to do that is we're going to place it in the oven for 2 hours at 425 to 450 degrees, and that'll get us down into that range that we're wanting to be at. Alright, now that we got our knife tempered back, I'm going to go ahead and put it in the vise, and I'm going to anneal this tang down to where it's nice and soft to drill, and then we'll move on to doing the bevels next. So let's get it in the vise and get it annealed. Alright, now the reason we have this clamped in the vise is because this vise is going to act as a heat sink down here, and as we chase this down and get this soft, it will not go past the jaws of this vise because it's going to suck all the heat out as it gets to this point. I will be using this little hand torch here, if it'll focus. You can buy these at usually any hardware store or Walmart. I actually picked this top up right here at a junk store, thrift store, whatever you want to call it, I think it was for $9, so not bad. Look around. When you're starting out doing this, look around, shop around, because you can find all kinds of deals, and it's a good way to get into it without having to spend a fortune, because once you get into it, you might find out you don't really like it, and then you're not out a lot of money. Alright, if you look here, I know it's kind of dark, but I don't have any lights in here rigged up yet. You can see the straw cutter we wanted here on the blade, and you can see the line here. The vise was clamped right here, and how it didn't take past where the vise was at. So we're going to go ahead and lay out our pinholes, and go ahead and drill them, and then we'll move on to grinding in the bevels. Alright, I'll be drilling these holes with a 5/32 bit. I am using my little milling machine here, but this can also be done with just a cordless drill or a corded drill. Either one works as long as you have a good flat surface to lay it on. So you'll see why I'm using this bit a little later. So let's go ahead and get these holes drilled. Alright, now I've got our 5/32 holes drilled. If you notice, I drilled a couple of other holes here in the middle. That's just to allow the epoxy to go back and forth. I'm now going to take a larger bit and chamfer these holes to knock the rough edges off, because when you drill, sometimes an edge will form around the hole, and it can interfere with your handle scales laying flat. So I'm going to go ahead and get the bigger bit, knock those down, and we'll move on to the next step. Alright, now the next thing we're going to do is we're going to scribe a line down the edge of this knife right here, and we're going to do it to determine where we want the final edge to be. What I did is I used some black spray paint. You can also use a Sharpie or Dykem layout fluid, pretty much anything that's going to leave a surface that can be scratched on there. So I let it dry. Now there's different ways you can do this. You can do this with a drill bit that is the same thickness as the knife. Drill bits have a point on them. It'll put a line right down the middle. You can use a height gauge, which is what I used. When I first started out, I used a digital caliper, though. It worked just as well. If you notice here, I have it on top of this piece of granite. You want to do this on top of something that is as flat as you can possibly get it. Now, they sell big granite blocks through knife making supply shops and industrial supply, but you can also go down to your local cabinet and countertop sale stores, and sometimes they'll have pieces like this right here that they're just throwing away. My nephew got these. I actually have 2 of them. He got them for free because it's a discontinued style, and therefore it didn't cost me anything. Another thing to do this with is just a big flat piece of just tile, you know. But what we're going to do is we're going to come in here and we're going to set it on top. That with this. And like I said, just starting out, the drill bit method is probably going to be the best way to go. Flip it over. And you would do this the same way with the drill bit. You would do it on one side, flip the knife over, do it on the other. Alright. Let's see if I can get this in focus here. You might be able to faintly see those 2 lines right there along the edge. That is where we will grind up to, and then we'll start moving our bevels down the sides of the blade, and then we'll come back and put our finished edge on it. So let's get to the grinder and get to moving some metal. Another thing I want to talk about before we move into the grinding process is file guides. These will help us make sure our plunge lines that we put on our knife are nice and even. Now this right here is a set of Creative Man file guides that I bought, but this is not what I started with. It's something I worked and saved money towards getting because they're not cheap, but they're worth every penny, especially if you're going to be doing this to sell your knives and make a living doing it. This is what I started with right here. All this is it is a support piece for the back of an office chair. It was hardened, it was springy. We cut it off with an angle grinder. Had a friend of mine drill these 2 holes in here, just some cheap bolts from the hardware store, clamped them together, got them as even as I could, and then just went to the grinder and ground a good finished edge on here. I used these for probably, probably 20, 30 different projects when I first started out. In fact, if you've watched the channel for a while, you've seen me do the Kopesh sword. These were used on the Kopesh sword. Like I said, many projects. I used them a lot. So let's go ahead and get them put on and get to the grinder and get to grinding in some bevels. Alright, now that we've got that really aggressive angle going up to our lines that we scribed on there, we'll go ahead and I'll change belts up to an 80 grit, and we'll start working this bevel up and blend it all together, and then we'll be ready to put our finished edge on. Alright, now our bevels are ground in, and I'm going to move over to the belt grinder again, and I'm going to clean up the spine area and around the knife itself to get rid of some of those deep gouges. Like I said, do the same thing with a belt with a 1x30 Harbor Freight grinder or a angle grinder with flap wheels. So I'm going to go ahead and take care of that, and then we'll be moving on and talking about the handle. Alright, at this point here, I strongly recommend spraying the sucker down with some WD-40. to help make sure it doesn't rust. Wrapping it with some newspaper or a paper sack, typing paper. Wrap it real good. Don't have to be pretty. Take some electrical tape. I like it because it's good and strong, stout. It helps keep it from getting scratched up. And then we're just going to wrap it real good and tight. And this is just mainly to protect all the work that we've just put into the blade. So when we're done with the handle, we can come back and just sharpen it. You could have went ahead and hand sanded the blade. That's up to you whether or not you do that. It does give it a nicer finish than just a belt finish. But next we're going to turn our attention to the handle and pick out some wood. Now a lot of times you're not going to have, just starting out, have an assortment of different types of wood to pull from. You may have some oak or some Osage orange or even hickory, because hammer handles, axe handles, pick handles are usually made out of hickory. You can get oak from pallets a lot of times, and of course they're boards, so they're fairly flat to start with. I'm going to be using Osage orange for this one because I have a lot of it that my brother actually cut up for me that we sent up here from Oklahoma before we moved up here to Alaska. So I'm going to be using that. And so let's get our piece found and get it marked out and move on to getting a handle on this. Alright, now we're ready to drill our handle scales. And the way that I'm going to do this is I'm going to take this masking tape. And I'm going to cover the handle scale. Usually go about 2 pieces. Okay. Alright. And then I'm going to do the same thing on the knife itself. Alright, let's go around with a pair of scissors here. It don't have to be perfect, but it makes it a little easier to see where the placement of the scale is in relation to the tang of the knife if you go ahead and trim this off. Alright, same thing with the wood here. Now I cut these scales out on my Portaband, and you may not have one. They're not very expensive pieces of equipment. You can get a Bower brand from Harbor Freight for about $145. If you plan on doing this and having a knife shop, they're pretty much a necessity, and that'd be a great entry-level model to use. But you can also clamp the handle scale material like we had here down to a workbench and use a jigsaw to cut it out. Alright, now that we got that glued up, or taped on, we're going to take our super glue here, and we're just going to put a little super glue on that handle scale. We're going to stick it on here. Right. Just like that. And then we will let this set up and then come back in and we will drill our pinholes. Now let's repeat the process on the other side, just like this side, and then we'll be good to go. Alright, if you remember earlier, I mentioned in the video that there was a reason I chose a 5/32 drill bit. And the reason for that is that that is the same size as a common 16 penny nail. That's the size, common nail. And so that's what we're going to use for our handle pin stock. It's just mild steel. I'm going to go to the bandsaw. You could also use a pair of pliers, cut the head off of these, and then I'm going to chuck them up in the drill and go to the belt grinder. You could also do it with a piece of sandpaper, and we're going to kind of clean up these edges on here to get it tapered down just a little bit because it's a little bit too big for the most part for our handle material to go all the way through. And we just want to get that rust and everything cleaned off, so when we put the epoxy in it, it'll actually mate up well, no problem at all, stick real good to it. So with that being said, let's get it going. Alright, now that we've got our handle scales to where they'll fit up on our knife nice and tight, I'm going to go ahead and run the pins back through the holes here. I'm just going to kind of eyeball up here where I want the end of my scale to be, which I'm thinking right in here. Draw this line. Just come in here, we're going to continue that mark around, like so. We're going to cut it off with the bandsaw, and then we'll use this one to transfer the line to our other handle scale. Cut it off, and then we'll go and we'll grind them clean, and then move on to the next step. Alright, the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to come in here, and this is the inside. This will be the part against the tang of the knife. And I'm going to rest my finger against it here and just draw a light line. What I'm going to use this line for is kind of an area to grind up to with a little bit of an angle, because we don't want to keep this sharp edge here, because it'll be pretty uncomfortable when you're trying to use this knife if your thumb or finger gets against that. So let's go ahead. I'm going to tilt the grinder back. You can do the same process with a file by clamping this in a vise and filing up the edge until you reach it. You reach the point you want to reach. So let's go ahead and get that done. Alright, that's what we're going for there on the end. And next we'll move on to hand sanding this up, and then we'll be ready to glue the knife up. Alright, I went in on the areas here we ground on the ends of our handle up by the blade and hand sanded it up to probably around 400 grit. And this is a step you don't want to forget, because if you forget this step when you do your epoxy, the epoxy will actually soak into the wood up here by the blade. And even though you clean it off, it'll still be in the wood. And if you come back at that point and oil up your handle or whatever, you're going to have discolored portions up here. So what I do is I use axe wax on my knife handles. I'm just going to come in and apply some up here at the end. And we'll let that dry a little bit, and then I'll wipe it down. The wood will absorb all that's going to, and we can glue the handle up. Alright, now it's time to glue up. If you notice here, I've got some Q-tips. I also cut some in half at an angle. That'll allow us to get up at the top of the scales once they're glued on and clean them up real nice. I just have some 5-minute epoxy here, a couple of these black little clips. You can use C-clamps as well. And I do have a small hammer here in case I need to peck the handle pins, and just some scrap fabric. Old t-shirts do a great job at that. So let's go ahead and clean everything up and get ready to glue up, and then we'll mix our epoxy up. You do want to clean all these surfaces with acetone the best you can. That'll help make sure that we get a good bond. Get all the oils and the dirt off of them. I mean, it don't look like there's much on there, but as you can tell, there's still a lot of residue. So we're going to clean that. We're even going to clean our wood here. And we're going to clean our pin stock. If this wasn't a file and was just a regular piece of steel, I would actually go in prior to all of this with some 80 grit sandpaper and scuff the tang of the knife. That just creates an area for the epoxy to bite in more. So let's go ahead. Alright, we let our epoxy sit up overnight. Everything's good and dry. I'm going to take this over to the vise and use the hacksaw to cut off these nails that are through there, and then we'll move on to the grinder and start shaping the handle, and then on to hand sanding, and we'll be wrapped up. Alright, now we've got the perimeter of our handle cleaned up. One thing I like to do is come in here with a pencil and mark like this. This gives me lines to grind up to, so I don't grind too close whenever I'm grinding up close to where the tang is. It's just a good way. It's kind of a safety barrier just starting out that I've found out is really helpful. You see that pencil line all the way around? Now let's go back to the grinder and we're going to start grinding this off. Alright, now I'm going to go to the slack belt. I'm just going to round this handle off, basically just knocking off all these sharp edges. Now this can also be done on a Harbor Freight grinder. There's a little metal platen that rides behind your belt that has two Allen nuts, I believe, or Allen screws. You can pull them out and pull that metal platen off, and it'll give you a decent little slack belt portion in which to work. So let's go ahead and get started up and get to cleaning the handle up some more. Alright, now at this point I'm going to go in and I'm going to hand sand the handle here, probably up to about a 220 or 400 grit, and then put some axe wax or some tung oil or boiled linseed oil, whatever your preferred treatment for the handle is, polyurethane, you know, whatever you have on hand, and then we'll be pretty much finished up. Let's see how it turns out. I'll be showing you guys here in a minute. Alright, pretty much done with hand sanding this handle. Now there is something to remember when you're doing this, is as you grind these knives, they'll get kind of sharp right here along the edges where a burr forms, and down in here in the finger well. So what I do is I'll take a small piece of sandpaper and I will sand these just enough to knock that burr off, both sides and up here on the spine. Ideally you can chamfer this as well around the perimeter whenever you're through doing your profile, but as you're sanding it, it's still, and cleaning up the handle, you're still going to get that. So it's best just to come back with a piece of sandpaper, maybe a sanding stick, and just address it so it's not rough on your finger. So, alright, let's get it wrapped up. Alright, there's how a little knife turned out. Not too bad. It's a great little beginner project. Like I said, you can do this without a forge. You can do it with minimal tools. Like I said, not bad for a file and some 16-penny nails. Let your imagination run wild. You You will have those people out there that bash the 1x30, and I mean, of course, no, they're not as good as a 2x72 professional made grinder or something, but you can make some pretty cool stuff with them. I actually have my first ever knife here that I made on a 2x72 grinder. This is actually my second knife. I made another knife that was supposed to be a kitchen knife. You can actually watch the video or I remake it here on the channel. But this is the second knife. This is a Bowie knife I made from a leaf spring. It was made entirely on a Grizzly 1x30, which is basically the same thing as the Harbor Freight 1x30. It just has Grizzly stamped on it, and it's built a little bit better, a little sturdier. But you can do some cool stuff on those kind of grinders. So go out and pick you one up. Like I said, about 45, 50 bucks. And give this a try. Get in the knife making. It's a fun hobby, and who knows, it may turn into a business for you. With that being said, I appreciate you for watching. If you would, hit that subscribe button down below. Share this video out if you would. Ring the notification bell to notify me of those content as it posts, and we'll catch you on the next one. Bye-bye.